Viewpoints on the talk station FM 107 AM 1240. Well, in keeping with our series of interviews we've been doing related to World War II veterans and Korean veterans as well, but World War II graduates, as I call them, definitely the world of hard knocks. We are continuing that with an interview this afternoon with Barrett Tillman. He is the author of an interesting book, The Forgotten 15, also the author of Hellcat Aces of World War II. But the title, Forgotten 15, The Daring Airmen Who Crippled Hitler's War Machine. And with that, Mr. Tillman, welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
It's my pleasure. I'm delighted to be with you.
Well, this is an interesting story, and I was compelled by the story and learning as I read about it. You said at the outset you had decided you were going to be talking about this particular group of pilots, the Forgotten 15th, and someone responded to you and said, but why? There was not much of a story here. And so you create a very compelling, just in the prologue, story about the fact that this group of B-24 and B-17 pilots were involved in a portion of the war that, well, didn't get a lot of publicity, but was critical to the war. And of course, that was basically breaking the logistics backbone of the Third Reich. A little background on you. What compelled you to write this story? What's your background in this?
Well, I was blessed to be able to grow up flying World War II airplanes. My father had been trained as a naval aviator in World War II, and it was just part of my environment growing up in Oregon. And along the way, I became acquainted with a growing number and variety of World War II flyers, not just pilots, but navigators, bombardiers, gunners, mechanics, people who were involved in nearly every aspect of military aviation. So a couple of years ago, in discussing what the next book should be with my agent, Jim Hornfisher, it just flashed on my screen that the 15th Air Force down in Italy, which conducted the southern half of the Allied strategic bombing campaign in World War II, was largely unknown. And over the years, I had developed, I'm going to say, about a dozen friends from 15th Air Force personnel. And the more I discussed it with them, the more enthused they were, because as you'll see in the book, there is still, to this day, an approximately friendly rivalry between the well-known Mighty Eighth in Britain and the Forgotten 15th in Italy. So I'm now to the point where when a new book is published, usually fewer than half of the contributors are still living. Right. So the Forgotten 15th became, as much as anything, a last-minute grab at history with an opportunity to tell the story of those forgotten individuals who made a major contribution to Allied victory. And
the experiences they had. Our guest, Barrett Tillman, by the way, in addition to this book, The Forgotten 15th, is the author of D-Day Encyclopedia, everything you want to know about Normandy invasion. And we're going to have to get you back on just to talk about that, Barrett. And he is a newspaper reporter. He frequently appears as a commentator on TV documentaries in addition to speaking appearances. And I like this. The Wall Street Journal hails him as a master storyteller. And with that, let's talk about the Forgotten 15th. As I'm reading this, the names, Jimmy Doolittle, Hap Arnold. As a matter of fact, I was intrigued when General Doolittle was tasked with forming the 15th. He had a hard time convincing then Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower of its value, I gather.
Well, Eisenhower was directed by the Joint Chiefs, the combined Joint Chiefs of Staff, the British and American High Command in London, to support establishment of the 15th in November of 1943. And at that time, most of the Allied operations in the Mediterranean theater were in North Africa. So Jimmy Doolittle had, I think it was less than 2 weeks, to move his then 12th Air Force headquarters from Tunis up to the middle part of Italy, Foggia and Bari on the Adriatic coast. And along the way, he realized that Dwight Eisenhower, the senior American general in the theater, was not very impressed with him. And it doesn't speak very well of Eisenhower, because it seems that he had, for lack of a better term, West Point snobbery. He was from the class the stars fell on, 1915, when something like 1/3 of those cadets became generals. And here's Jimmy Doolittle, who is, quote, only, end quote, a reserve officer, a 2-star general at that time. But I make the point in the book, what Eisenhower did not seem to realize at that time is that Jimmy Doolittle knew more about aviation than Dwight Eisenhower knew about anything.
But wait a second. This is the same Jimmy Doolittle who flew B-24s, or is it B-25s?
B-25s.
Off a carrier to bomb Japan in, 1943?
April of 42.
April 42, okay. And in the process was recognized for his leadership and bravery with the Medal of Honor.
That's correct.
So, he was already an MOH recipient, and General Eisenhower was not all that impressed. I'm impressed by that fact.
Well, I was acquainted with General Jimmy, as he was known in those circles, and he was a very, very gracious individual. He just exuded warmth and sincerity, and he made the point, I think, a couple of times in one of his memoirs. I think it was titled "I Could Never Be So Lucky Again," that eventually he convinced Eisenhower that he, Doolittle, really did have a near unique grasp, not only of aviation generally, but military aviation. And therefore, when the staff was pulled together in Britain to start planning the Normandy invasion, in January of 1944, after only 2 months in Italy, Doolittle was called to London to run the 8th Air Force under Eisenhower. And Doolittle wrote to his wife that he said, "I think I finally sold myself to the general."
Right. And of course, in the process, had to put together an Air Force of a variety of folks. You have Canadian airplanes, you have 2 different types of U.S. aircraft, but he was also responsible, as I gather, for all the fighter aircraft as well, including, I think, a contingent of Red Tails.
Yeah, the 15th Air Force was exactly half the size of the 8th Air Force when both had reached their peak in mid-1944.
How many airplanes are we talking about in that contingent?
A number of airplanes, boy, I would hesitate to guess, but I can tell you that the 15th Air Force at its peak had 21 bomb groups, that's B-17s and B-24s, each with 4 squadrons. And then it had 7 fighter groups, P-51s, P-38s, P-47s, and then it had a couple of reconnaissance outfits with P-38s, and then the 15th had its own carpetbaggers, the sort of aerial commandos who dropped supplies and secret agents behind enemy lines throughout southern Europe and into the Balkans. So it really was a varied command, and as I said, it was responsible for the southern half of the strategic bombing campaign.
The remark that our guest, Barrett Tillman, has just made related to the carpetbaggers is in response to a comment I've shared with him prior to this program, and that is I had earlier interviewed Russell Bond from Swansboro, himself a tech sergeant, a radio tech sergeant aboard a B-24, involved in the carpetbaggers. And when I mentioned that to our guest, Barrett Tillman, he instantly knew of what I was talking about. It's a group I had never heard of. And so is the term carpetbaggers pretty much a standard term, Barrett, on the issue of how that particular group, how they operated as, if you will, black ops for the Air Force?
Yeah, black ops is a good way of explaining it. Carpetbagger became a generic term for any squadron or group that was involved in that activity.
Okay.
It began with the British, I think, in 1942, and then when the 8th Air Force arrived in England and got operational on a larger basis in 43-44, Doolittle's command started its own carpetbagger operations. And then when D-Day occurred, shortly thereafter, that is in the summer of 44, the Allies had occupied most of northern France, which had been the main area where the carpetbaggers dropped their supplies and their agents. So there was not much of a need for them, and consequently, one of the 8th Air Force carpetbagger squadrons transferred down to Italy and continued doing the same work there.
Our guest, and I want to continue this conversation here in just a moment with our guest, Barrett Tillman. He's the author of Forgotten 15th, The Daring Airman Who Crippled Hitler's War Machine. You're listening to Viewpoints here on the talk station, FM 107, AM 1240.
Hey, it's Big John R. Buy, sell, trade, and give stuff away on Swap Shop, Saturday mornings at 7 on the talk station.
And now back to our program with Barrett Tillman, the author of Forgotten 15th, The Daring Airman Who Crippled Hitler's War Machine. We're talking about a group of pilots and technicians, the entire crews that were involved in an activity, well, that didn't get a lot of publicity, and that was breaking the logistics of the Nazi war machine, particularly the oil fields. As a matter of fact, you point out in the book that Hitler purposely positioned these refineries and some of the supply situations and stations in areas that would be easy to defend. And I want to get into that. What was it like for these pilots as they were flying into heavy flak areas? And you do a great job in description of what it was like in aerial combat as well, and the tight circumstances. I always get the B-24 and the 17s confused. I didn't realize that they were very similar in their payloads and their abilities to carry out the same jobs. Before I get into even the issues of what it was like on these bombing runs, what was the difference between those two airplanes? Was it significant?
The B-17 was called the Hollywood bomber, in part because I think in 1938, Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy made a movie called Test Pilot, and Gable is involved in testing the then prototype B-17. It's kind of a potboiler movie, but aviation audiences love it because of the aerial photography. The main difference between the two is that even though they were both four-engine heavy bombers that held an almost identical bomb load, usually about 4 tons for a useful distance, the B-17, having a larger wing, it had more wing area, usually could fly higher than the B-24, but the 24 had the advantage of a thin airfoil. It's called the Davis Airfoil, dated from, I think, the late 1920s. And it was quite a bit faster than the B-17. It could cruise 25 to 35 miles per hour faster at a given altitude. So the two bombers really complemented each other rather than opposed, although, as I mentioned in the book, there was a healthy rivalry between B-17 and B-24 crews.
Here they are flying into heavily fortified areas, flak, a high number of defenders in the air. I've talked to both pilots and co-pilots and others who've flown heavy bombing runs. The fact that they could not move, they had to stay in formation, that had to be very difficult because Hitler was very aware of the importance of the oil fields and the refineries and the steel mills. And we're talking now also about major population centers as well. What was it like as you talked to these pilots?
You know, some of them to this day, not just the pilots, but other aircrew, have not told their families very much about what they experienced, and that's probably understandable even 70 years later. And it's gratifying to me on so many cases where a book will be published, and I will hear from not just children and grandchildren, but nieces, nephews, and even close friends who say, Uncle Bob never talked very much about what he experienced in World War II, but now, thanks to what we see from other veterans who had similar experiences, we understand more about him. And that's really gratifying to me because today there's nothing remotely comparable to what the World War II generation of airmen experienced. The major difference between then and now really is not technological, that is props versus jets. The main difference is scale. One of the best examples I can give you is that in the continental United States, from 1942 through 1945, the Army Air Forces lost 14,000 airplanes and 15,000 airmen in training accidents just in the lower 48 states. And today, that it's true today. If a squadron commander loses an airplane, his career probably will suffer. So
I want to go over those numbers very quickly. This is training exercise. This is in training only.
Yes, it's in flight training. It's in operational training.
And what period of time again was this?
That was 1942 through 1945.
They lost how many in training?
They lost 14. The Army alone. I don't have the numbers for the Navy.
Uh-huh.
The Army Air Force alone in those 3 years, less than 4 years, lost 14,000 airplanes and 15,000 airmen in those aircraft. And that didn't cost Japan or Germany 1 gallon of gas or one 88 millimeter shell.
It also shows you how focused we were at that time. And I think that's what fascinates me, as I shouldn't say think. I know it's what fascinates me as far as the World War II veterans and the communities and the fact that there was this focus, there was this determination. There seemed to be no discussion, no hesitancy or way to derail it. In talking to one World War II veteran, he was telling me how long he was in theater, and he said 16 months. And I looked at him and I said, 16 months, that's almost a year and a half without R&R. And his response was very casual, very cavalier. I was there for the duration. And it instantly hit me. The word duration meant till victory or defeat. It was absolute. There was and it was a mindset. Am I thinking correctly?
Oh, absolutely you are. The commitment that the nation had during the Second World War probably is unprecedented before or since. It's a secondary point, but we've all heard Tom Brokaw's description as of the greatest generation. Personally, I have problems with that because I don't, as much as I admire and respect my parents' generation, I'll quote one of my fighter ace friends, Joe Foss, who was the top Marine ace and governor of South Dakota. He says, shoot, we weren't the greatest. We just did what we had to do. Right.
No, it's. I like to tell the story. I had the pleasure of chatting with Lieutenant General Doug Odell, the United States Marine Corps, during the midst of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and brought that same subject up, and he quickly turned to me and said, no, this is the greatest generation. And, of course, the men and women he was leading in theater there as well was obviously, we recognize that they're doing their job. But still, it is impressive. Not only is it the generation, but it was political clout as well. It was the willingness to, if you will, afford these losses and these risks to win what unquestionably was one of the greatest military challenges that the world had ever seen, let alone this country. Our guest, and I really appreciate him taking the time to be with us this afternoon, Barrett Tillman. He is the author of The Forgotten 15th. And I want to go to something near the end of the book, and it's in memoriam. As of 2012, about 73,000 Americans were still missing in action from the Second World War. Most of them, of course, will never be found. They lie in a long-lost, hasty graves, entombed in sunken ships and planes, lost in jungles, overgrowth, or simply blasted into nothingness in the era of high explosives. To that point, as we discuss this book of yours and your research for D-Day and the Memorial Day events of the past week, do we understand just what we were talking about a moment ago, Barrett, about the absolute commitment, I don't even use the word sacrifice, but this commitment? Do we understand that?
I'm not sure that very many people today really do understand it because there's really been nothing comparable. One of my self-assigned studies after 9/11 was to ask people who remembered Pearl Harbor to compare it to 9/11. And I forget the numbers now, but the large majority said that the shock of Pearl Harbor was greater for a couple of reasons. Number one, although there had been tension with Japan for a few years prior to Pearl Harbor, there was nothing like the decades of terrorism that preceded 9/11. And the other is that everybody recognized, whatever their previous attitude was, when the sun came up on December 8th, 1941, every single American was going to be totally focused for however long it took, right, as you say, for the duration, to win that damn war. And General Eisenhower's first book was called Crusade in Europe. And to a certain extent, I think that's an apt title, because World War II really began as a fervent crusade. And as it went on, people became more resigned to it. It was, I think, more often than not, just a dogged resignation that, by golly, we're going to see an end to this damn war, and then we'll get back to living.
As we wrap things up, Barrett Tillman, our guest, the author of Forgotten 15th, the daring airman who crippled Hitler's war machine. A fascinating book. And of course, the personalities that you develop in this as well. And going to Hap Arnold. And I mean, these are names that I know. And Jimmy Doolittle and of course, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. As you develop the personalities, it's also how the war itself is developed and the challenge that these pilots, and I'm just going to leave it at that for our audience. I'm going to commend the book to you to read what it was like for these pilots and the experiences. It does beg to the issue, and we've learned now, and I think as a new, in my case particularly, there's a new energy and concern that we capture these stories, because it was a time that was unique, coming out of the Depression. Basically, the lack of awareness that we had, the world politique at the time. There was dispute, obviously, politically associated with this, but all of a sudden, this shock of being brought into the global environment. We have an opportunity to talk to people who are, I think, at that bridge, or if you will, at that twist in our country from a country of an insular community now to a world community.
Well, that's exactly right. Yes.
This book is, again, another example of what I would argue we need to do. We need to talk to all those folks who live in our neighborhoods, who were in some fashion or another, even if they were in stateside and didn't go overseas. If they remember those days, we need to record those. You bet we do. And I would encourage people who are interested in that to check with their local libraries, their state history association, any outlet that is able to help support oral histories. And an oral history does not need to be conducted by a PhD historian. It can be done by somebody with a tape recorder and a list of questions, and that information is perishable. It needs to be recorded now. Our guest, and I thank him for being with us, Barrett Tillman, the book Forgotten 15th. Mr. Tillman, thank you very much for being with us. We do appreciate your time this afternoon. Oh, I'm delighted to join you, and I'd welcome the chance to come back anytime. Definitely. Viewpoints on the talk station, FM 107, AM 1240.